morning, everybody, and welcome to our special conversation, lecture, talk about Vietnam's culture and history. I'm Todd DePastino. I'm the director of the Veterans Breakfast Club. And in my prior life, I taught courses on the history of Vietnam and the Vietnam War. I welcome you all this evening to this, I guess you call it a lecture and a conversation. That's what I like to think about. I've been looking forward to this all day because I feel like I'm able to come and talk about some of the history of Vietnam that I know and enjoy talking about. And then I also learn some Vietnam history from the people in the room here who know other things and more than I do. We have Hai Cao here joining us. Thank you, Hai, for joining us again. I see we have Jill Hunting. Thank you so much for joining us, Jill. Scott Masters, the greatest history teacher in Canada. Nancy Smoyer knows a lot about Vietnam history. She's read a lot. And then, of course, we have all those wonderful people, including Nancy, who were there, who served in Vietnam, and so have a first understanding of the country, at least from their perspective during the Vietnam War. I'm joining you tonight from Bordentown, New Jersey. We have a Veterans Breakfast Club breakfast here in Bordentown, New Jersey, which is in the Delaware Valley, south of Trenton, New Jersey, east of Philadelphia. We have a wonderful event planned for tomorrow morning. The folks at the Armed Forces Heritage Museum here in Bordentown, New Jersey, have put together a great Veterans Breakfast Club event. We're going to be doing our veteran storytelling just like we do in person in Pittsburgh, except we're doing it here in New Jersey. So I drove here today for this event tomorrow morning, and I very much I'm in a Holiday Inn Express. That's why I'm not in my usual attic. It's good to get out of the attic. It's been a few years now. Thanks for joining us. And how we structure this is I'll talk for 45 minutes about Vietnam history. I show some slides that aren't, they're not necessary. You don't have to, see and make out everything on each slide to understand the talk. But this is the fourth in a series of, I think it's going to be 6. I think I'm going to do 6. I think I'm going to do it again next week and the week after. I think there's just so much to cover, and also because I feel a little badly tonight's and last week and this week, the talks are a little abstract. They're not, we're focusing on the prehistory. You might call it the prehistory of the Vietnam War, the part of Vietnam history that a lot of Americans don't pay a lot of attention to or don't think about very much. And it's the part especially that has to do with the French colonization of Vietnam. So we're going to do the prehistory of the Vietnam War. And it's not going to be like last week and this week. It's not going to be a march of events so much. It's not going to be this happened and then that happened and then this happened. I'm going to get back to the march of events, I think, next week. This is going to be a bit of a broader understanding of the deeper patterns at work, the patterns that fueled French colonization in Vietnam, and the patterns that generated the enormous revolt of Vietnamese, especially peasants, in Vietnam through the early 20th century. These are deep underlying patterns. If you picture, you picture a volcano erupting and you see the eruption and it's very exciting to describe it. But underneath, of course, for years and years, you have the lava. What is it? Lava? Yeah, lava. You have the lava underneath, inside a volcano doing its thing and building up for years before the final explosion. So I want to talk about what built up and created that final explosion and how that explosion then was transformed. Because it's one thing for peasants to have grievances. It's another thing for peasants to revolt. And it's quite another to forge those grievances into a movement for national liberation. And that's precisely what Ho Chi Minh achieved. And that's the great achievement of Ho Chi Minh's life, is to take these peasant grievances and forge them into a movement for national liberation, which was not easy. And it took decades and decades to hammer out and forge that movement. Never straightforward, never easy. So I'll jump into my talk, and we're going to pick up kind of where we left off last time with the state of Vietnam with France's arrival. And I want you to I want to give you a sense, first of all, of what Vietnam was like before the French arrived. And all of you have a good sense of it, I think, because you all took 8th grade social studies. And in 8th grade, think back to your 8th grade social studies teacher and remember learning about feudalism. Remember how exciting that was? Learning about feudalism and no, it was not exciting because nothing ever happened under feudalism. Feudalism is all about stability. It's all about immobility. The feudal system is a static one, deliberately a static one, and it's mostly very often represented in diagrams like this, like a pyramid. And you'll recall that at the top of the pyramid is the king. And by the way, feudalism is a social system that has existed across the globe and across the millennia, not just centuries, but the millennia. It's virtually alike wherever you see it, in Africa, in Asia, Europe. Here in the US, when we learn about feudalism, we mostly learn about what it looked like in Europe, because that's where the rapid transformation from feudalism to market capitalism took place. And feudalism is characterized by like this kind of very static pyramid, this very rigid hierarchy where you're born in a part in this pyramid, and you stay there your whole life. Your children stay there, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. At the top, of course, is the monarch or the king, but then the king technically owns, or at least, well, God owns the earth. The king is God's representative on earth to manage some of God's property, say England. And then, but England is even too big for a king. So then England has to kind of subcontract out the management of the property to dukes and lords and nobles and stuff like that. And then the nobles go on down till finally the people who actually work the land are the 90% of the population, the peasants. And they're at the very bottom of the pyramid. And it's a very static system. It's a very oppressive system. It's a system that does not emphasize mobility or progress at all, or change. And it's an unjust, unequal system. And the only reason that the peasants, the 90% of the population, put up with it is because the system at least guarantees their survival. That is the goal of the system from the peasant point of view. The system is there and oppresses them. They do all the work, but at least those above them are given the task of ensuring that the peasants survive disaster. And disaster in a peasant world usually means famine. It can also mean other things, but famine is the big threat that always hangs over the peasant like a sword of Damocles. I mean, that the peasant's life is not hard, it's not challenging, it's perilous at every moment. And at any moment, a peasant could drown. And that is always the threat that a peasant lives under. And so the landlords, peasants live in these protective villages that protect them from famine. And usually the village has a lord or a landowner who owns most of the land, usually not all, but most of the land in the village. And they live in the manor house, and the other peasants pay rent to them. And they live a wealthy, good life compared to peasants. And peasants put up with it, no problem at all, so long as the Lord does his job. And his job is to ensure that peasants survive. In other words, if there's a bad harvest, the Lord will get into his rice stock, his wheat stock, or his rye stock, and will distribute food to the peasants. The Lord always, somebody gets married, the Lord throws a party. Somebody gets buried, the Lord throws a party. Somebody gets born, the Lord throws a party. The Lord is always throwing parties. The Lord is always giving out food. The Lord is always giving out wine. And the Lord is essentially there to take care of. He's the pater, the pater, the father of the village. He's there to care for the peasants. And of course, this is a hard job if you're a lord. The peasants are always demanding more. The Lord is always trying to escape some of the duties. it's kind of the battle, it's the tension that's built into the system. There's a constant tension between the peasants on the bottom and the lords on the top, and they're always at each other. And, you know, the lords are always trying to get away with kind of shirking some of their responsibilities to the peasants, because there's always more money to be made. There's always, you know, there's always more opportunities that these lords have to give up because they're so responsible. It's a very paternalistic system, and they're very responsible for the peasants. So when the lords start to stray too far, that's when the peasants activate. This is a very deep tradition, and it runs along a single pattern no matter where you find it. We could be talking about Belgium, you know, in the 1700s. We could be talking about the Middle East in the 20th century. We could talk about Vietnam in the 20th century. No matter where it happens, it all follows the same pattern, because peasants are they're very deferential, and they don't start by cutting off the head of the lord. They start by kind of formally petitioning. And here's a picture of some Russian peasant elders. This is very typical of a kind of a village elder meeting, where they discuss their grievances before they prepare it and present it to the landlord. It's a very formal presentation. We have these grievances. You know, we felt that the wine was too watered down at the wedding. You know, we've had some family hardships here in the village, and we think that more common land should be ceded to the village. You know, whatever it is, it's a formal petition. If that is ignored, then the peasants usually will escalate the petition to a higher ranking noble apart from their lord, even to the king. And that's when things get really bad. If they go to the emperor, to the king, they will escalate with a petition. And this is just an example of a petition of peasants to the king of Romania in 1912. Romania was going through a similar transition in the early 20th century. Eastern Europe and Southern Europe it took them until the 20th century to get out of feudalism entirely. So that's the second stage. The third stage, if the king ignores it or the emperor ignores it, and this is what happened in Vietnam, then the peasants mobilize into their secret society, their militia. This is when Robin Hood begins to appear. Captain Swing is another example of one of these anonymous secret societies. And what they usually try to do is they do a little terror. They burn out buildings. They burn the Lord's fields. They hang the Lord in effigy. They send a warning. Here's a picture of a peasant secret society called the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, otherwise known as the Boxers, the Boxer Rebellion in China. That's why they were called the Boxers, the Boxer Rebellion. That was the name of this peasant secret society. It was a rebellion of the Boxer Rebellion in China in the 1900s began as a series of peasant revolts against the landlords and against the emperor, and it ended up bringing down a whole dynasty, these peasant revolts. And then finally, if the terror doesn't send the message to the landlord to straighten out, then there's an outright peasant revolt. And the revolts, peasant revolts, tend to be extremely bloody, extremely violent, and very short. They're very short-lived. They usually are an act of absolute desperation, and they usually focuses on eliminating the nobles that they feel are committing the crimes, and then liberating the stores of food and kind of restoring the equilibrium of the village. These peasant revolts are intended not, the word revolt is good. These are not revolutions. These are not attempts to replace an old system with a new system. These are revolts intended to shock the system back to the equilibrium that had existed before. These are always backward-looking movements. These are movements that want to set things back to the way they were, to sometimes like a golden age. That's how peasant revolts kind of always operated, and that's how they operated in Vietnam. really the movement against the French, the revolt against the French began really as a series of peasant revolts, mainly because of what the French did in Vietnam. Now, what happened? There have been peasant revolts through history because there's always this tension in the feudal system. But the revolts became something more. These revolts become something more when there's a larger, when there are larger forces at work intending to replace feudalism. I'll try not be so abstract and obtuse here. History has replaced feudalism with market capitalism, industrial capitalism, and it's a wrenching transition wherever it occurs. The first occurrence was in England, and it began, historians have traced it back to the 1200s in England, when capitalism begins to replace feudalism. And this is when there are massive peasant revolts, because this is a massive wrenching change. Eventually, capitalism replaces feudalism just about everywhere. And everywhere it occurs, there are wrenching revolts and even revolutions, wherever it happens. And there are some exceptions, but there are, we can get into those if we want to. But it really is fascinating that wherever the transition from feudalism to capitalism happens, it is wrenching. It happened in Eastern and Southern Europe, as I said before, in the late 19th and early 20th century, and it happened in Vietnam in 30 years. I mean, so feudalism is replaced in France over the course of 100 years or so, and it leads to the French Revolution. Capitalism replaces feudalism in England over maybe 300 years, and it leads to the English Revolution. It happens over 100 years, and leads to, in Germany, it leads to the German Revolution. It happens in Russia, it leads to the Russian Revolution. Do you get the pattern? You see the pattern? Wherever it happens, there's a revolution. It happens in China and led to the 1911 Chinese Revolution. In all of these places that I'm showing, France, England, Germany, Russia, China, it happens over a long period of time and still results in revolution. In Vietnam, this transition occurred in 30 years. And it occurred at the point of a foreign occupying power, France. So no wonder there would be such a ferocious response to something that is disruptive generally, but when a foreign power comes in, occupies your country, and then enforces the change in 3 decades, it's inevitable, I think, that it would cause a revolution. And I just want to outline some of the ways that what the French transition did to Vietnam, and how feudalism is dissolved by capitalism. And mainly it's through the introduction of the principle of private property. I'm going to stop sharing just because I want to look into the camera and emphasize how important this is. We don't think of it, we take for granted, I think, the principle of private property. But the principle of private property is really distinctive to capitalism. And under feudalism, private property is not clear. Property ownership is not clear at all. And if you want to get really technical about it, nobody really owns anything. Everybody is, even the king doesn't own England. He just is a steward for God of England on earth. And that's kind of how it works. So like a landlord might own land, but peasants have also a right to the land. This is very confusing. In England, it was called the copyhold. I think copyhold in England was eventually abolished only in the 20th century. Tenancy rights might be a better way to put it. In other words, a landlord owns land, but the tenants have ancestral rights to farm that land, and they cannot be evicted. That seems to go against the rights of private property. If you own the land, you should be able to rent it to whomever you like. but that's not the case under feudalism. So there's this complex system of rights. Peasants belong to the land belongs to them, but it also belongs to lords and also belongs to the king. And the lines of private property are very unclear. So one of the things that the French did is they introduced, and wherever it happens, wherever feudalism dissolves, it's because of a strong redefinition of private property. And you know, these revolts take place different Ireland, you know, these catastrophes take place in different places around the world at different times, but they all involve this redefinition of property. And what that allows, the legal redefinition of property, what that allows landlords to do is take control of their land and start evicting peasants who aren't paying rent. They can consolidate their land holdings. So for example, here you have, in England, it was called the enclosure movement. That was the term that historians have given to this movement, enclosure. And you can see here on the left, right here, this is a typical peasant village. You can see there's a common land here. These are peasant fields. The villagers actually live here, but the fields are distributed around the village. And you can see each of these strips is owned, say, by a different, or farmed, I should say, by a different family, and extremely inefficient. Efficiency is not the goal. Survival is the goal. Survival and efficiency are two different things. So survival is the goal. The strips of land are distributed throughout the village. And this over here is much more modern. This is much more rationalized. This is a system where you have, you know, the large plots of land farmed and owned by one person. This is much, much more efficient. You also have common lands. As you can see, this is a typical feudal village where, you know, maybe a quarter of the land, maybe even more, is owned in common. No one person owns it. And it's used as a kind of reserve social insurance for peasants to use, especially when things get hard. One of the first things that the French do in Vietnam is they begin to sell and auction the commons. This happens wherever feudalism dissolves, is privatizing the commons, selling the common land, auctioning the common land, because it's so inefficient. You're never going to grow your economy by having, you know, a quarter or a third of your land being common land that's not being optimized for a particular use. So this is one of the first things that has to go when you transition to a modern market economy. And it's devastating to the peasantry. You know, if it isn't planned for, if it isn't, you know, if there aren't contingencies for those who are being disrupted or displaced by these changes, then it's really a social catastrophe. The other thing the other mode, or the other way that these systems change, these, you know, one is through the legal system, feudalism, changing definitions of private property. Another is through a financial system, taxation especially. Taxes work to create a market capitalist environment. And taxes function very differently in a feudal system than they do in a modern capitalist system. And I want to outline very quickly, and each one of these things we can spend a lot of time on, but these are really just highlights and giving you a sense, a taste of what ordinary Vietnamese peasants were experiencing in the early 20th century with French colonial rule. Here is the flag of the Nguyen dynasty. You know, probably, I think I've mentioned that there are two rival dynasties in Vietnam when the French arrived, the Trinh and the Nguyen. The Nguyen was the larger southern dynasty that eventually wins out. This is the flag of the Nguyen dynasty, and the Nguyen emperors, you know, they collected taxes. The Nguyen emperors, they had taxmen, armies, soldiers who went from village to village collecting taxes, but the rates were generally lower than the French would impose. The French came in, and you can imagine peasants. I think that many peasants in Vietnam didn't really care that the French were occupying Vietnam. They didn't really care that they were paying a French person tax rather than a Vietnamese person tax. What they cared about was how much the French were taking. That's what they cared. In other words, I think most Vietnamese peasants, they didn't give a whit about the emperor. They just wanted to give the emperor what he was due and have him go away. The other thing about the emperor is the emperor didn't come around very often. This was a big administrative burden to have to go around an entire empire and collect taxes. So in an average year, the emperor would get around to about a third of the villages. So you could expect, if you're living under the Nguyen emperor, you could expect to have the taxman come around every 3 years. French didn't operate like that. Uncle Sam doesn't operate like that. Uncle Sam, we all know, April 15th, tax day. Every year, we know it, we have to pay it. It's not like Uncle Sam decides one year, you know what, I'm going to head to Pittsburgh and make sure all those people are getting their taxes paid. This is a uniform system. This is a modern bureaucracy. Modern bureaucratic systems don't function as casually as the old empires did under feudalism. So the collection is annual. Third, under the emperor, there would be a sliding scale based on harvests. That was very much taken into account. In other words, the ability of the peasants to pay taxes was taken into account when the taxman came around. The rates weren't set by experts and clerks and functionaries in the capital. The rates were set as the taxmen went around village to village and they understood what the yields were in each particular village. The French did not operate like that. Budgets are set a year in advance. Rates are set a year in advance. And the rates are uniform every year. Budgets have to be predictable. Revenue has to be predictable. This is not something that you make up on the fly in a modern bureaucratic system. So they were much less forgiving. In other words, in the Nguyen Emperor, for every 20% loss of harvest, there would be a reduction in the tax due. If your yield, if you had lost 80% of your crop in a particularly bad year, no taxes due. You'd be tax forgiveness because of the extreme poverty of the situation. That was not the case under the French. There were uniform rates and they were due regardless of what the yield was or regardless of what the income was. This is a really big one and a subtle one, and it's one that often gets lost in history. The emperor, when the old imperial Vietnamese emperor collected taxes, he collected it from the village. This was a village tax. Imagine the power that gave village elders. This meant that the emperor came to a village and said, hey, this village is going to owe us this amount. You guys decide how you pay it. And the village elders would get together with usually a priest, and they would have several meetings to determine how much each family kicks in, essentially, to pay the tax. And this is important because the villagers are the people who are living on the ground. They understand if there's a sick family member. They understand if somebody has not been able to, collect a harvest, or somebody's field suffered inordinately. They will be allowed to go easy in what they contribute to the taxes. This is extremely empowering, as you can imagine, to the villages. And the emperor recognizes that. In fact, there's that saying, the laws of the emperor bow to the customs of the village. That's how primary the village is in the feudal political system. The village is the primary unit of belonging in the peasant world. And in Vietnam, the village, it's everything. The French don't operate that way. It's a head tax, a household tax. Every household owes it. This strips the power of the villagers and of the village as a collective unit, and it puts the burden or the onus on each family. It kind of privatizes the tax burden. And this is really devastating to the Vietnamese. And then finally, and this is the major one, if you want to really pick out the major one, taxes under the emperor could be collected in all kinds of different ways. The emperor would collect it in salt, would collect it in rice wine, would collect it in rice itself, sometimes livestock. In other words, there'd be a lot of negotiation, as you can imagine, in timber and fish, you name it. I mean, there would be a lot of negotiation between the villagers and the taxman over how this tax would be paid. But it mainly would be paid in kind. It mainly would be paid with crops or something like it. The French insisted that their taxes be paid in money, in cash. Cash is tough. Peasants, no matter where they come from, and it's amazing to think here I am talking. Every one of my great grandparents was a peasant, and so they were people who, before they came to the United States, never handled money. They probably had not seen money. Money is just not used in a rural, feudal kind of a system, and the scramble for money when the state starts imposing tax that has to be paid in cash is just, it creates a mad scramble for cash. In fact, that's why my great-grandparents came to the United States, to earn cash to send back to their villages to pay tax and to buy land. So that's why a lot of immigrants came to the US to get money, cash money, because the United States was one of the places where money flowed. Money was used for everything. So where do you get money in 20th century Vietnam? How do you get the piastres to pay your taxes to the French? This is the big question that peasants suddenly have to face after 1900. And the one place where they would attempt to get some of these piastres was on the market, taking surplus rice that they had grown and selling it at the market. Traditionally, peasant markets were very close to the villages. In other words, you might have a constellation of villages of 10, 20 villages with one common market. And every season, the peasants would go to that market, and that's where they would do their buying and selling. It was very predictable because it was a very local and small market. Prices didn't change much year after year, and you could plan that, say, and we talked about last time, if you have 100 kilograms of rice as a surplus, you could pretty much guarantee that that's going to be enough to sell, to have enough to pay your taxes, and to buy any livestock or equipment or medicine that you might need, anything that you can't make yourself. Under the emperor, markets were small, they were local, and they were stable. Under the French, they were global, and they were highly unstable, very volatile. The French really succeeded in making Vietnam one of the greatest, certainly the top 3 rice producers in the world. Absolutely. Vietnam had always produced a lot of rice, but nothing like what it produced when the French got involved, because the French were all about rationalizing production, making these farms more efficient, making them bigger, having them be run by gang labor, having them be growing one strain of rice, and then selling that rice on global markets. So for the first time, in 1860, you could say, for those of you who have a screen large enough, in 1860, Vietnam exported 60,000 tons of rice. In 1930, they exported 2 million tons of rice. Vietnam became one of the largest exporting rice exporters in the world under the French. And what this meant now is that Vietnamese rice was competing with rice from China, from Burma, from Thailand, and throughout Asia. This meant Vietnamese rice was now competing in a global rice market. And it meant that the price of rice fell just through the floor. I mean, I think that the price of rice fell probably 50% between 1920 and 1930. And that meant peasants lost their purchasing power. Because when they brought 100 kilograms of rice to market, it was now not enough to pay their taxes and to buy their livestock and equipment and any medicine that they might need. Peasants lose, and peasant surpluses lose that purchasing power. This is a wrenching experience. Now, there's another option you could have for earning some of this cash money to pay your taxes, and that is to hire yourself out as a wage laborer. And peasants do this, millions of peasants do this between 1900 and 1930, 1900 and 1940, millions upon millions of Vietnamese peasants. They leave their villages for the first time because they have to. I'll bring up Domenico DePastino, my great grandfather. Again, he was 16 years old when he came to the United States, and his village had sent him on a mission to earn money to send back to the village. This was extremely common in a peasant experience. This is it. You take young, strong men, you send them out to earn money. That's what you do. They send the money back to the village, you hope. My deadbeat great-grandfather, he stayed here and built a whole new life here, which is why I'm here. He was supposed to go back. And that's very much the story here in Vietnam too. They send these young men out to work, and they go to work and they sell them this indentured servitude. They sell themselves to bidders, to contractors. Contractors will pay the family cash, and then the contractee becomes a servant, and they get shipped to a tea plantation in Dalat or a coal mine in northwest Tonkin, Vietnam, or maybe a rubber plantation in Cochin, China, down in what we would call 3 Corps or 4 Corps. And they would very often die on these plantations and in these coal mines. I mean, this is really, really servitude, slavery kind of conditions. I think 17,000 rubber plantation workers died on the rubber plantations between, say, 1910 and 1930. 17,000. I mean, just Michelin had a really bad reputation, especially for just brutal working conditions on these places. I highly recommend, by the way, and I recommended it to our travel group. We're leaving for Vietnam on November 27th. And I recommended that our travelers, if they want to get a sense of kind of the prehistory of Vietnam before the American War, a good movie to watch is Indochina. This movie is now 30 years old, but it really holds up. It's a really beautiful and gripping film. Catherine Deneuve, it's French, so you have to read subtitles. Catherine Deneuve is a French woman who owns a rubber plantation in Vietnam. She inherits it from her husband, who dies, and she's a widow. She adopts a Vietnamese girl who's seen here in this picture in the upper right. The Vietnamese girl, it's such a great love story. She falls in love with a dashing French Navy officer and runs away from her family to join him. Ends up kind of living with a peasant family. And it's great because through her, and she's like royalty in Vietnam, through her, you get to see how ordinary Vietnamese peasants live. And it's really hard to watch. I mean, it's wrenching. These people are absolutely starving, and they have been evicted from their land because they couldn't pay their taxes or they couldn't pay their rent. And they're on the road looking for work, and they eventually sell themselves in a slave market. I think that's the only way. Dragon's Island was the name. It's an infamous place in Vietnam. It's in the Ha Long Bay. Dragon's Island was a place, it was a slave market. You would go and sell yourself to a contractor. You would be held in a cage, put on essentially something like a slave ship, and then sent to a plantation somewhere to work. And really, really brutal, some brutal scenes here in the movie, but I highly recommend it if you want to get a sense of just the roiling uh, upheaval of Vietnam in the early 20th century before the US got involved. By 1930, 70% of Vietnam's peasants are without land. They're landless. 70%. 50% were deemed by French health officials as permanently malnourished. These are examples of postcards that the French would send back. This is kind of like local color. On the right, this is the family that really gets me. The caption is, this is a family of lice eaters, beggars on the roadside. You have to imagine Vietnam in 1930 as being teeming with homeless people. I mean, millions of people on the roads. They've left their villages. They're eating bark off trees. They're dying on the sides of the road. They're selling themselves into servitude. I mean, this is a really, really desperate situation. And it shouldn't be surprising, I guess, that it would end in revolt. And it's what's remarkable about the revolts, and the first great revolts were 1930-31. What's remarkable about these revolts is how pre-modern they are. You would expect by 1930 that the peasants would have gotten a hint that feudalism wasn't coming back. But that's not what happened. What happened was the revolts occurred up and down. Each one of these little POW marks here and the explosion marks here in Vietnam represents where a revolt took place in 1930. And you can see they took place almost everywhere throughout Vietnam. None of them, they were not connected with one another, although there did seem to be contagious. In other words, one would happen in one set of villages, and then another few miles down the road, that they would revolt, and then they would revolt. So it was like a chain reaction. But these were all very local revolts, and there was an attempt. There was great hope among one of the few nationalist parties, the only nationalist party there was, the Vietnamese Nationalist Party there on the left, the Vietnam Quoc Dang Dang. They tried to organize these revolts. This is a party that wanted to drive the French out of Vietnam. They tried unsuccessfully to organize these revolts into some kind of larger pattern, some kind of larger movement against French occupation, some kind of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, national liberation movement. They tried to kind of organize them, to coordinate them. No success. The Indo-Chinese Party had just been founded by Ho Chi Minh, who was in Hong Kong at the time. Ho Chi Minh, by the way, before he founded the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, founded the French Communist Party. Ho Chi Minh was one of the founders of the French Communist Party, which still exists today and still elects candidates to parliament, to the French parliament. Ho Chi Minh, one of the founders of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party tried to organize, tried to, coordinate these revolts, and they just didn't work. They just couldn't do it. Those who were revolting were still stuck in the present mindset, in the peasant mindset. And I'm going to give you an example. The most violent and most dramatic events occurred in Ho Chi Minh's own home province of Nguyen An, and also the neighboring province of Ha Tin in the north. These were they're still celebrated today. In fact, I think there was a series of plays in Vietnam of these peasant revolts, but they're very distinctive. Here's what happened. These were particularly hard hit provinces by famine. 1900, you have 80% of the population malnourished. You have people eating bark off trees. A lot of people are dying, and the peasants just do what they traditionally do. What they wanted was, all they asked for really was that the rice stores, the warehouses filled with rice, to be shipped overseas, be released to the starving peasants. And to achieve that release of the rice stocks, they marched on the provincial capital of Vinh to present a petition to the French colonial administration. Very peasant thing to do. The French, fearing that the headquarters was going to be attacked, sent out a squadron of bombers that dropped bombs on the petitioners, killing 200 people. The people scattered. A few hours later, they came back to retrieve the dead, and there was a fear that this is another group, that the French dropped another bomb, killed another 15 people. That was it. The peasants did what peasants do. They got violent. They seized an arsenal. They seized the weapons. They killed every French person they could find. They killed every Vietnamese collaborator or landlord that they could find. They released the rice stalks to the peasants, and then they retreated to their villages. And they redistributed land, and they started operating once again as a feudal peasant village. This is all they did. They didn't coordinate with other villages. They didn't coordinate with other parts of the country. They kind of retreated back into that hard protective shell of the traditional peasant village, as if they could revive the old feudal system again that, helped to guarantee their survival. Of course, the French, it only took, I think, a matter of 9 months for the French to regroup. They sent in the army. They reoccupied Nguyen and Ha Tinh by June 1931, and they executed, the French did, 10,000 rebels. This put an end to the rebellion. And this was very much, it's very much part of the living history of Vietnam today, these revolts of 1930 and 31, because it was seen as a very instructive moment for the leaders of national liberation, for those who were part of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, for those who were part of the Indochinese Communist Party. They realized, number one, that there was an impulse for revolt throughout the land, that the peasants were ripe for revolt, ripe for rebellion. But they had yet to be indoctrinated into the ideology of nationalism. They were still thinking of themselves as villagers. They were not thinking of themselves as Vietnamese. And what they had to do, what had to be achieved before a movement against the French could be successful, is the Vietnamese people had to be taught that they were Vietnamese, that they were not their local village, they were not their family, they were part of a larger entity, a national entity called Vietnam, that could be independent from the French. And what that is nationalism. Nationalism is something that I think that we kind of take for granted today. But nationalism is, nationalism is the sense that you belong to a nation, the United States of America, or I'm French, or I'm a proud Russian, or I'm, we take it for granted because I think it's so common in 21st century, in the 21st century world. But it's a relatively recent thing. And you could have a state without a nation. We know that. You could have a country called, say, Iraq, without people thinking of themselves as Iraqi necessarily. And you could also have a nation without a state. You could have a people who think of themselves as Palestinian, but they don't have their own state. Or Kurdish. They're a nation, but they don't have a state. So the state and the nation are two different things. And bringing those two different things together, I think, is one of the projects of nationalism. One of the first, here's an example of how long it could take. Building a state is one thing. Creating a nation is quite another. We know that, of course, having gone through the storm and stress of Iraq and Afghanistan, and the project of nation building, the attempt to build a kind of national identity in places that seem very resistant to national identity. Well, this is pretty much the story of every nation. I mean, one of the first nations created was when Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon got married. And watch this, look at this high-tech animation. They got married and they created something called Spain. You take Castile, you take Aragon, you put them together, and Castile and Aragon had been hammered together from much smaller kingdoms over time. But in 1469, they get married and they create a new nation called Spain. It took at least until the 1800s for the people living in Aragon and Castile to start thinking of themselves as Spanish. It requires all kinds of education, all kinds of indoctrination. You need a flag, you need a national anthem, you need a, you need a whole different, you need a language, a common language, you need common customs and traditions. This is a long, drawn out process, and it's very hard and very onerous. Here's Italy. Italy was not a nation. You think of Italy, what's an older nation than that? Italy was not a nation at all until 1870s. There wasn't really an Italian language until long after Italian unification in 1871. This is Germany, another recent nation. This is what Germany looked like, all these different little principalities and kingdoms in 1789. It wasn't until the 1870s, again, that Germany becomes what we know of as a nation. What about the United States? When Abraham Lincoln, the United States becomes a state with the US Constitution in 1787, ratified 1789. We're a state, but are we a nation? Big debate. When Abraham Lincoln gives his inaugural address in 1861, he uses the word union 20 times. Never once does he use the word nation. I think that's significant. He's still thinking of the United States as a collection of states, a union of states, not one single national entity. In 1860, it was common to use the term United States as a plural. United States are a republic. Something happens in the Civil War, and you see it in Lincoln's own rhetoric. The Gettysburg Address, he uses the word nation 3 times. He never uses the word union. It's over. We're now a nation. And it's the Civil War kind of settles this issue. Only after the Civil War does the United States become a nation. And certain kinds of people promote the project of nationhood. And I don't want to digress too much. I'm an American historian, not a Vietnam historian. But in the US, the big debate between Jefferson and Hamilton at our founding, a lot of that was, should the US become a nation? And nationalists like Alexander Hamilton were very different from the non-nationalists or the federalists or the Republicans, I should say, like Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton, the people who embraced nationalism, and I'm going to stop sharing again to emphasize this, I think, the people who embraced nationalism historically are people who live in cities, they're people who engage in long-distance trade, they're people who are not tied to villages, and they're people who can envision relationships with people they don't know personally. Think about a long-distance trader, somebody like Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton literally was coordinating overseas trade when he was 14 years old in Nevis in the Caribbean. He's from the Caribbean. He's somebody who understood trade. Think about that. Think about how, if you're coordinating shipping goods 500 miles away, and then they're going to ship you payment later, you have a real relationship with with the people at the other end. You are dealing in the same language, maybe you're dealing with the same kind of money. You start to see your interests as being one, even though you don't see each other face to face and you live 500 miles. Those kinds of people are the kinds who can begin to imagine a nation. They are not peasants. Peasants cannot think beyond their village. They don't want to think beyond their village. It takes a modern bourgeoisie. The French have a word for it, the bourgeoisie. It means city dweller. It takes a modern city dweller to begin to imagine, I think, nationhood. And that's exactly what the first Vietnamese nationalist was. He was not a peasant. Look at him. He's not a peasant, Phan Boi Chau. Phan Boi Chau is still very much admired today in Vietnam, very, very well known today in Vietnam. He's considered a Vietnamese patriot, a hero. He's really the first Vietnamese, popular Vietnamese nationalist. He was the first one to really promote the idea of Vietnamese nationhood. And he was exactly as you would imagine a nationalist to be. He was not a peasant. He didn't work the land. He had worked for emperors, and then he'd worked for the French. He was a bureaucrat. He had worked in cities. He traveled for his work. So he saw that the Vietnamese in Vinh were very similar to the Vietnamese in Da Nang, were very similar to the Vietnamese in Hue. He began seeing these connections that were one big country. And he was also involved with what the French did. And what the French did was built the infrastructure to create a nation. If nationalists are people who can engage in long distance trade, well, you need lines of communication, you need roads, you need railroads, you need dredged ports, you need a banking system. I mean, for a nation to exist, you need a physical infrastructure to connect people. And Phan Boi Chau saw that that's exactly what the French are creating. They created roads, they dredged rivers, they built a 1-mile bridge across the Red River. They built the what's now called the Reunification Express from Hanoi to Saigon. They introduced all kinds of new banking reforms, and they integrated the different sections of Indochina into one entity. And then, of course, as we talked about last time, they also introduced these ideas about liberty, equality, fraternity, these ideas about nationhood and nationalism and revolution. In French, Phan Boi Chau said, and this is going to be, Mrs. Farrell, please, I apologize for my pronunciation. She was my French teacher in 8th grade. La pression nous vient de France, mais l'esprit de libération aussi. The French brought us oppression, but they also brought us the spirit of liberation. That's what Phan Boi Chau said. That was his leading concept. We have to embrace what the French have given us in order to resist the French. So Phan Boi Chau's program of national liberation was Vietnam must modernize. We should become like Japan. Japan was a country that was forced to open up to the West in 1853, and they modernized very rapidly to become a major power in Asia, modeled on the European model. Vietnam should become that. Phan Boi Chau actually traveled to Japan to see how the Japanese did it. And the independence movement must be led by people like him, he said. The people who understood what Vietnam was, the people who had vision beyond the village. And he said, the peasants are going to have to be either left behind or they're going to have to just follow in our wake because they're too backward to lead this kind of revolution. Phan Boi Chau's movement, while he's still an inspiration, was an abject failure. He was hounded by the French secret police. He spent some time in what would become known as the Hanoi Hilton, a prison in Hanoi that we will visit on our trip to Vietnam. He eventually spent, I think, at least 15 years under house arrest, and the whole movement that he led just collapsed. And he knew that. He had plenty of time to write as he was under house arrest. We will see this tomb, by the way, and I'll be the only person to be excited about this. I remember I screamed like a little girl when I saw it in Hue, right on the one end of a bridge. I was so excited to see this memorial to Phan Boi Chau. Here it is. He's looking very fierce on the left. But he got to write his memoirs, and he said, "My history is entirely a history of failure. But there is no doubt that our nation will achieve independence eventually. Now there are people more able than I am. Have you ever heard of Nguyen Ai Quoc?" He wrote this in a letter. Nguyen Ai Quoc. Let's talk about him. That's one of the names that Ho Chi Minh used. He used it for many years. He used probably 50 to 100 names. It's remarkable how little we know about Ho Chi Minh, considering what such an important figure he was. For many, many, many decades, we knew almost nothing about him. A professor at Penn State University was able to uncover a lot of information that had been previously unknown. For example, we now know his birth name, which was Nguyen Sinh Kung. Didn't know that before. He changed his name early on to Nguyen Tat Tat. And then when he moved to France, he became Nguyen Ai Quoc. He was not a peasant. He was the son of a scholar, Nguyen Sinh Sac, who had worked for the French and then also resisted the French. As a young student, Nguyen Sinh Kung served as an interpreter. He knew French pretty fluently. He served as an interpreter. Nguyen did as a, or Kung did as a, for a peasant revolt. And he became eventually a wanted man by the French. So at age 18 in 1908, Ho Chi Minh left Vietnam, and he would not return for 33 years. He became a cabin boy on a steamer. He worked as a pastry chef in the Parker House Hotel in Boston. You can see a plaque on the wall that says that Ho Chi Minh was once a pastry chef here. He reportedly worked also as a chef in Harlem. He studied under Escoffier in Paris. He eventually settled in Paris and got involved in the socialist politics there. He was a founder of the French Communist Party. And he began to see, I think you could almost see in his thinking, he began to understand, and Nguyen Ai Quoc means Nguyen the Patriot. He called himself Nguyen the Patriot and began to write tracts promoting the independence of Vietnam from France. And he began as a nationalist and then started really, you began to see that he seemed to understand that the only way to get the peasants on board of nationalism was through communism. And I hope that you've been picking up that the traditional peasant feudal way of life is very communalistic. It's very communistic in many ways. And so there's a way that you could package communism as almost a return to the golden age of a feudal system. And I think Ho Chi Minh understood that. He used a lot of different aliases. He moved around the world. He lived in Moscow, lived in China, arrested in Hong Kong. And he's the one who would eventually see that the key, I think, to achieving the liberation of Vietnam from France was going to be to somehow marry the nationalism of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party with the communism of the Indochinese Communist Party. That somehow, if you could have a communist-led nationalist movement that would incorporate people like Phan Boi Chau, middle class, professional, managerial, educated types, with the bulk of the Vietnamese peasantry, you could achieve a movement that could be strong enough to overthrow the French. But getting the peasants on board, you're going to have a heavy dose of communism. You're going to have to leaven the indoctrination of nationalism with a heavy dose of communism, because that's the only way you're going to be able to reach peasants who really have no natural affinity for nationalism, but they understand what communism can bring when you put it in terms of common lands, collective ownership of land, that kind of thing. So in 1941, after 33 years outside of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh decides it's time to, and this is where I'm going to end the talk and pick it up next week. Ho Chi Minh decides it's time to return to Vietnam for the first time in 33 years because he saw this as an opportune time. It was an opportune time because it was the darkest hour in Vietnamese history. The French had been, now had a collaborator in controlling Vietnam, and that was the Japanese. The Japanese had invaded in 1940, had stationed 150,000 Japanese troops in Vietnam, and the two collaborationists, Vichy France and the Japanese Imperial Army, the two controlled Vietnam together. And Ho Chi Minh thought this was an opportunity. This is before the United States gets involved in World War II. He's banking on that somehow the Soviet Union, not involved in World War II yet, and the United States, not involved in World War II yet, are going to somehow get swept up in the war. The US and the USSR are going to become allies. They're going to defeat Germany and Vichy France and Japan. And they are going to grant Vietnam independence at the end of the war. That was the gamble that Ho Chi Minh was taking. And it's remarkable how close he came to being right. He came very close. I mean, it's, you know, he got 90% there. He snuck across the border from China. He lived in this cave in the Viet Bac, way up north near the Chinese border. And it was there that he met for the first time Nguyen Ai Giap, Vo Nguyen Giap, I should say, and founded the League for the Independence of Vietnam, the Viet Minh, the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh, the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. And what the Viet Minh were a communist-led front group for the national liberation of Vietnam. It was an independence movement led by communists, but inviting other members, other nationalists into the movement. And how that movement fared will be where we pick up next time. Okay. End of my chatter. Let's talk. And you are muted, I know. So if you want me to unmute you, or you want to say something, and I sure hope you have something to say, I'm sure you do, let me know here. Jill, what do you have to say? You're smart. Mary, you're smart. I'm going to unmute the smart people. Hi, you're smart. Larry, nah, we want to unmute you. Just kidding. Hi, how are you? Please unmute yourself.
I'm very good, and I'm very happy to be joining all of those American veterans that I came to respect and love a lot. But tonight I particularly love Todd, because I couldn't believe I see you very well versed in the history, and you talk about the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, and you even show the flag. And I'm so proud to sit in here and introduce myself to the rest of the group. I am the latter-day vice chairman of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party worldwide.
How about that? Wow. And so you really do. So, you know, hi, would you consider like a Fanboy Chow kind of, you know, one of the pioneers of a movement that you're a part of?
Absolutely. And I might add, I don't know if you know about this, you didn't want to say that, but the part that you in your lecture, that the Vietnamese Communist Party and allied with the Vietnamese Nationalist Party were very correct. And I don't know you know this, but the founder of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party was a law student during the French, and his name is Trương Tử Anh, and he developed the like, you know, how do I say this, like dân tộc sinh tồn, just like communism, but this is for nationalism, like, you know, that you have to follow all of this, and, you know, the theory.
Yes.
But it was Ho Chi Minh, because Ho Chi Minh was trying to ally with, and one of the people, the Ho Chi Minh tried to convince him, one of the guy who left Communist Party and joined the Vietnamese nationalist party convinced Trương Tử Anh to fight the communists first. That means the Ho Chi Minh party.
Yes.
And then come back and fight the French. But the Trương Tử Anh say he thought about that, and he said no. He had to be allied with the Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party to fight against the French, because he did not want the latter day, the generation later, if he was not succeed, blame him for collaborated with the enemy, which is the French. So, and then what he got, he turned around, he got I'd say like killed by Ho Chi Minh.
Yes.
So that part, I don't know, you don't want to share that, but that's the story about my party.
Oh yes, and Ho Chi Minh was quite the killer of rivals. Anybody who came close to being a rival of his, he was successful in taking out often. Absolutely.
And that part, I regret that happened, because otherwise the latter day of the nationalists and the communists fight until I came to the US, because all those things that Ho Chi Minh did.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for joining us and adding, your firsthand experience with this very complicated and bloody history. I'm looking at Nancy Smoyer here, Dona Dolly in Vietnam. Nancy, you emailed me. You've been sitting in on these talks, and you emailed me. It was an interesting note that you sent. You said that you read a lot. You've read a lot of Vietnam, about Vietnam, but you've kind of stayed away from the broader histories of the country and the war. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah. I didn't want to read the histories. I started reading the books about Vietnam as they came out shortly after the war, but I couldn't read the history because it was just, there were so many opportunities when we could have not done what we did and could have stayed out of that war and had so many more people that were alive. And so it was just too depressing but I could read the stories of the veterans, the men, over and over and over again, but not why we should never have gotten in there.
There is kind of a tragic, it's hard to read as an American, and especially as an American who knows so many Vietnam veterans. It's hard to read the history of Vietnam without thinking of the end the whole time. In other words, without thinking, how could history have turned out differently? How could this have been avoided? And so reading it that way, it's really a tragic history. Greg Yost, how are you, Greg?
Doing well, Todd. Thank you so much for this presentation. Wow, and this whole series, I think it adds so much to our understanding of everything that went on, not just sort of in any one sort of, isolated battle or whatever decision in terms of sort of, whatever. Okay, you understand where I'm going with that. Right. There's the old colloquial saying in sort of human development that half of what we learn before the age of 6. And I think that your notion of sort of this grand tradition of sort of what people grew up with in Vietnam or anywhere else sort of comes into play here in terms of the peasant psychology, the peasant notion and everything. So I appreciate this sort of deep history, because I really think that what happened in Vietnam or anywhere else in the world is so much based on what we learned so much earlier in our life and how that perpetuates over generations. So I appreciate that angle. I had a couple of very specific questions about Ho Chi Minh. And one is, and sort of getting back into that deep history, we need to recognize that in the European tradition, the notion of nationalism really only took hold in the 19th century. And a person with all of his other faults who deserves a lot of credit for that, or blame, however you want to accuse it, is Napoleon. And with the Napoleonic Revolution all throughout Europe, he of course, met his end, as we all know. But what he instituted throughout Europe was the notion of sort of national identity. Yes. And there's even some maps that show that where the Napoleonic Code took hold in Europe, across those sort of Central European German principalities, is basically the line of division that occurred at the beginning of the Cold War between Eastern and Western Europe. That Western Europe was very Napoleonic and Eastern Europe was very pre-Napoleonic. And that's a very interesting contrast in terms of sort of the whole national identity and rights and equality, fraternity, liberty, whatever. So cross-applying that way across the world to Vietnam, we see Ho Chi Minh coming along who adopts these principles. And my questions then becomes two. One is a very specific question about the Treaty of Versailles, where I think that Ho Chi Minh showed up at the Versailles Peace Conference asking, as Woodrow Wilson, US president, said, we need to have national identity, national self-determination. And he went and he was completely rejected by the US, by Woodrow Wilson, by the other European powers. So this notion, this Wilsonian notion of national determination was really a very Northern European, white, deterministic type of thing. Did Ho Chi Minh actually show up at Paris and meet with Wilson or Wilson's aides and say, we want freedom? You've talked about national self-determination. We want national self-determination in Vietnam, and was sort of thumbed off.
Yes, he did. And the negotiations in Paris at the end of World War I, this would have been in 1919, were unbelievable. I mean, the people who came from around the world to petition for because the world was the world had been torn apart by World War I, and the Paris Peace Conference was a way to try and put the world back together. Well, how it's put back together, this is an opportunity for Romania, for Ukraine, and lots of people send representatives for Palestine, lots of Arabs send people to Paris to kind of pitch or lobby for their national project. And Ho Chi Minh absolutely, when I clock, he was one of those. He didn't meet with Wilson or even Wilson's people, but he did write to Wilson's people, and he requested that Vietnam be considered for independence from France. And yes, it was rejected because Wilson's 14 points and self-determination was really only intended for Europe.
Continuation of that, going into the 20s and the 30s and to 1941, then when the Japanese occupied Vichy Indochina, admittedly, the Japanese were very European. They had very much adopted European customs in terms of industrial production and military, yada, yada, but they were nonetheless Asian. But there was nonetheless, even though they were sort of just allying with the Vichy French, there was sort of nonetheless this notion that these Asians can come along and take control of our own turf over the Europeans. So even though the Japanese collaborated with the Vichy French in a certain sense, that also empowered the local Vietnamese to say, hey, we Asians can do this on our own over these master race European types. Is that? Okay.
Oh yeah, the Japanese, for all the brutality that the Japanese visited upon Vietnam, and it was a brutal occupation on par or worse than the French were. Initially, especially, they were seen as this was an inspiration. They were seen, initially by some as maybe even a liberation from the French, but certainly it was an indication that the French were weak and that they could be vulnerable to an Asian resistance. Thank you, Greg. Bob Flage.
Yes, sir. First of all, excellent presentation on Vietnam. One thing that really struck me strange was when you were talking about the peasants making appeals to the higher authority, was that Romanian form that they had developed that in 1912, obviously to have a form like that, the higher authority must have taken it serious that these guys would cause a revolt if they didn't respond to certain things. And that, having that form, format the way they could, lodge their complaint.
Yeah, and often that worked. Often, I mean, most of the time there isn't a peasant revolt. There aren't terror acts. Usually those kind of petitions do work. They do achieve at least some kind of, reform. And it's interesting that a lot of most peasants don't know how to read or write. So they're usually the peasant leader is usually not a peasant. Peasant leaders are usually not peasants. They're people like Ho Chi Minh. They step in.
Or Vladimir Lenin.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, George Kniss, how are you?
Pretty good. I'm getting there. Hey, this is excellent. I just wanted to say that 60 years ago, when I was in Saigon, I wanted to learn everything I could about the Vietnamese society, since I was going to spend a year there in a war, or in a burgeoning war. And I joined the Vietnamese American Society. But I was only able to make it to a couple meetings because I wanted to learn about the culture and the nature of the war and everything. I had read about the French experience, and I was hoping we weren't going to repeat it. But I never got the background that you're providing now. This is so great. Because I think veterans like myself can put this in perspective, that the time we spent in our young life, whether sacrificed or injured or killed or anything, was worth it. Was worth it. So this more comprehensive view of Vietnamese history and what they were all about over those years is important. So I want to just congratulate you. You made up for 60 years of ignorance on my part, and I'm catching up. Couple comments. You were talking about that Vietnam wasn't a nation. It didn't have a national identity. Now, in my readings, I had read about Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin parts of Vietnam. Do you consider those as like proto-states or provinces that made up the biggest bulk of
Great question.
becoming? Because I didn't hear you mention those three names.
I mentioned them last week because inventions, Tonkin, Annam, Cochin China, they were inventions of the French that divided Vietnam. They banned the use of the word Vietnam, banned the use of the word Vietnamese. And so those who lived in Annam became Annamites, they were called.
Right.
Vietnamese. And so they were really an effort to kind of break up this burgeoning nationalism that Vietnam was experiencing.
Oh, so it was another French invention.
Really
the French, man, they are so good at.
And they called the whole thing French Indochina. They redefined it as French Indochina. Like, think about that term, Indochina, like kind of taking away that Vietnamese distinctive
identity. Yeah. Hey, one other question. You mentioned about Ho Chi Minh in Paris and France, and I had read about him. He was an actual lawyer, an attorney. Was he not?
I don't know about that. Was he?
Yes, I had read about that he was a lawyer or identified himself when he was in Paris. Okay, another question is that you said he was the founder of the French Communist Party? I thought it was the Vietnamese Communist Party.
No, he was the founder, and it's interesting. He was the founder of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, and that's significant work. And also of the French Communist Party. Before he founded the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, he founded the French Communist Party.
Was he a partner in it with other French people or
Yes,
what?
He was.
Oh, okay.
He was.
Now it's all coming together.
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yep.
Thank you, Doctor.
Jim Roberts.
Nice, Todd. Say, my connection's a little unstable, so if I disappear, just go on without me. As I've told you before, my introduction to Vietnam was a good bit different. I spent 6 months in training before going over as an advisor, and the broad outlines of what you presented were part of what I learned before I went to Vietnam. And I want to comment and echo what a lot of the people have said. For me, you filled in a lot of the gaps that brought over you didn't have. And I thank you very much. The one thing I can say is my experience there left me with a much different attitude toward Vietnam than a lot of veterans. And I don't blame them for that attitude because they didn't have the background or the benefit of the information that was given to the people in my class before we went over. It might have been a different outcome for a lot of veterans if we'd had that kind of background.
How was your attitude different?
I got to know the Vietnamese as people. We have veterans who have very, very serious feelings against the Vietnamese. And I just see it as two groups of people in very unfortunate situations. I got in very big trouble. I lived in a village, my 5-man team, we were with a 4-man district team, which included my boss, the district senior advisor. And I was talking to him one day and I said, I'd really love to have a cup of tea with my counterpart. And he said, you have tea with your counterpart twice a week. That was Captain Key, the Vietnamese regional force commander. And I said, no, my Vietnamese Viet Cong lieutenant who's out there and has been out there for years, I just like to have a cup of tea with him and talk about why he's there and what he thinks, because he's never going home. I'm leaving in 6 months. He's not. And the major got very angry with me. It was like I was speaking traitorous words.
You were that curious even then, huh?
I mean, we've got this major war machine behind us, and they're running around with pieces of tires cut out to like a foot with rubber straps on them. I mean, they go into battle with one magazine. I carried 10 magazines when I went into battle. I mean, I can't imagine fighting the war the way they fought it. It would have been nice to just understand more about what they were thinking.
Oh, how interesting. Thank you, Jim. Hi. You were able to correct, Ho Chi Minh was never an attorney.
No, he's never. From documents that I read, it's also, I just want to contribute that from what about whether he was the founder of what Communist Party. From documents books that I read, he wanted to be joining the Soviet Union, back then the Russian Communist Party, but he was rejected by Stalin because they didn't think much of him.
Yes.
And what I read was that that's when he turned into I believe Truman or President something of the US, and they rejected him. And until Mao Zedong won against Chiang Kai-shek and took over mainland China and turned it into the Communist Party, that's when Ho Chi Minh had his ally to support him all the way to winning the Dien Bien Phu and divided the country.
Yes. Oh, how great. Hi, yes. That's my understanding as well. Ho Chi Minh eventually fell out with the Soviets under Stalin because he was too nationalist. He was seen as being too interested in Vietnamese independence and not as interested as he should be from the Stalinist point of view in, workers of the world uniting.
Right.
And so he was kind of on the outs there. And that's what helped, I think, push him to the Chinese. I think you're absolutely right. That's an excellent point. Bob Flage.
Yes, sir. I agree with Jim about needing to know more about the country when we got there. I was there in '67, and we didn't get any briefings or anything. However, when I got there, I was a replacement to the 9th Division, and I saw pamphlets that they were given. The 9th showed up in January of '67, but they had been given some type of a small, pamphlet with information. And but like I said, I got there in May of '67 and never received anything of that nature.
Oh, boy, it's amazing how young you were and how you're being dropped into the middle of history, a complicated history, and really having to try and figure it out on your own. Just amazing. I'm looking at Bill Silver here. He, like Jim Roberts, lived with the Vietnamese people with a Marine CAP unit, the Combined Action Platoon. I mean, got to know the Vietnamese people personally. He was a kid, just a kid. How are you supposed to, how are you supposed to figure out these complex patterns and loyalties and conflicting loyalties and fight a war at the same time? I'm just amazed by it. You guys just amaze me. Thank you so much for nerding out with me tonight on history of Vietnam. I would love to, let's do this again next week. Let's do it on October 26th. This will be more next week. Let's do a more march of events. And this will be, I think, much more familiar to many of us. I would like to pick up the story of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh movement during World War II. And then after World War II, as Hai mentioned, Ho Chi Minh approaches President Harry Truman in 1946. I want to talk about that. And then I want to talk about what we call the First Indochina War, which is the war of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh against the French. That war is fought over 8 years, and at the end, the French essentially have to capitulate, and that's when the United States steps in. This is a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for enriching my life and my understanding of Vietnam. Le Duan, oh hi. If there's a villain in history, Le Duan is it. We should talk about him.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh man. Hey, Daria Summers, good to see you. Good to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope to see you again Monday night. We have our program on the Beirut bombing, barracks bombing, 40th anniversary, 1983, and then we'll be back a week from tonight to pick up this conversation about Vietnam. All right, everybody. Good night. Take care. Stay well.
Good night.